For months, speculation has grown on when the next offensive in the war in Ukraine would begin. After successful counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, Russia has found itself pressured on several fronts. As the winter set, the lines began to freeze. Russia, undergoing a quiet mobilization that has seen the number of troops committed to the war increase somewhere north of 300,000 troops, has eyed an opportunity to regain the initiative. Meanwhile, Ukraine, coming off two consecutive and strategic victories, seeks to win the war once and for all, securing freedom and the survival of their national identity. While the lines froze, the war certainly did not. In a brutal style of war reminiscent of World War I, boiled into a raging fire around the town of Bakhmut. While Russia has attempted for months to take Bakhmut, losing thousands of troops in the process, Ukraine sought to continue pressure in the north by the town of Kremenna. Despite local offensives by both sides, no tremendous breakthrough has occurred, and that's taken us to this week, where concern of a new Russian offensive on the anniversary of their invasion in February 2022 is soon to pass. Let's dive through what happened in Ukraine this week, in what is the first edition of a weekly series for this channel. Of note, each of these videos will be designed to build off earlier episodes, and this one will include references to some of my older videos, which are linked below. From a strategic level, both sides have eyed a new offensive, and either offensive could be a knockout blow, or usher in a transition into a long, protracted war. I've already dug into what those offensives could look like in these two videos, which are linked down in the video description. With the offensive in mind, Russia on a number of occasions launched strategic bombing attacks across Ukraine, including for the first time in a long time, the eastern city and the province of Lviv. This signaled to some that the offensive was, in fact, beginning, but there was no large-scale aerial attack, nor was an armored penetration similar to what we saw on the first night of the war happening. I'm going to dive into why this may be the case and why we may not see a large-scale deep strike offensive later. Speaking of offensives, Russia did kick off some local offensives that span into this week that are important to note, because these feed directly into the strategic picture. Towards the south, Russia launched an assault on the town of Vuhledar. So far, the results have been disastrous. Combat footage from drones has shown the assaulting elements attacking in a column across open ground and without support from air or artillery assets. These failures are believed to have decimated the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade and became a huge controversy among Russian bloggers. These bloggers claim that the same Russian commanders responsible for previous assaults that also ended in disaster were in charge of this attack. This failure cost Russia dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, to say nothing of the many killed, wounded, and captured. To the north, the Battle of Bakhmut rages on. It appears that Wagner remains in charge of this effort. However, there appear to be some elements of the uniformed Russian army present as well. The integration and joint use of these forces has certainly left some problems, and that's certainly evidenced itself in the way that this battle has gone on and the high amount of losses between the two groups. Wagner head Prigozhin stated that the objective is to take Bakhmut by the February 24th anniversary of the war beginning. You can see that this week, Wagner and Russian forces stepped up the rates of attacks to the north and south of the city, clearly attempting to envelope it and, more crucially, cut Bakhmut off from its main supply routes. There were claims this week by Russian forces that the E40 MO3 highway had been severed to the north. This has taken weeks of fighting, but critically followed the fall of Vuhledar a few weeks ago, and now the fall of Pereskovlivka, which would effectively cut the E40 MO3 highway leading into Bakhmut. It's been reported that the heaviest fighting has occurred along the south and east of Bakhmut, where Russian forces have pushed west towards the H32 highway. Thus far, Ukraine has managed to hold. In fact, they've pushed Russian forces back in some areas, but also note that across this area, both sides have traded towns and neighborhoods over the past several months. The fighting around Bakhmut has been the bloodiest since likely World War II. In fact, the US is reported to have recommended to Ukraine that they conduct a tactical retreat to secondary fighting positions outside of Bakhmut in an effort to preserve forces and not suffer such high attrition. But it's clear that Ukraine has instead opted to continue fighting and will hold Bakhmut. This may grant them an opportunity that I mentioned in my video on the Ukrainian Counteroffensive, where Ukraine needs to hold through Russian attacks and over-attrit Russian forces to the point of exhaustion, and that opens the opportunity for counterattack and potentially a knockout blow. Since July, it looks like Russia is happy to grant this to Ukraine, and as a result, Russia has lost thousands and potentially tens of thousands of troops and mercenaries. Put a pin on this point because we'll return to it in a moment, but for now let's go a little further north to Kremenna. Here, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that retook Kharkiv slowed to a stop, and Russia has fought hard to hold the Svatova-Kremenna line, which is considered this highway that runs north and south between Svatova in the north and Kremenna in the south. In recent weeks, Ukraine pushed forward to the south of Kremenna, but by all accounts hasn't yet managed to breach the city. This past week, Russia launched another offensive here, pushing westward, likely in an attempt to relieve pressure on the city by forcing Ukraine to rotate forces west and away from direct action on the town. This offensive hasn't managed significant progress westward, but it does appear to have effectively pinned the Ukrainians in a fight in this area. These three battles, including the Russian strategic bombing runs, have given many the impression that the Russian offensive has already begun. There's believed to be some 300,000 Russian troops committed to the war in Ukraine, either actively fighting in Ukraine or staged along the border. One area of concern is the Sumy Oblast to the northeast, where Russian forces attempted to push Kiev via this province last year. It doesn't look like Belarus is going to take part in an attack, but it's not yet known if Russian forces will again push south from Belarus, but there's some belief that they won't. There was even a rumor floating around that Russia would employ up to 300 aircraft during this offensive, which sounds like a great way to lose your air power. Both Russia and Ukraine have denied airspace to each other, effectively air parity by domain denial, which is part of the reason why neither side has managed significant breakthroughs and the war has really been fought on the ground through attritional combat. This takes us to a report by the British Ministry of Defense, which I think is worth paying attention to. They report that Russia has lost somewhere between 140,000 and 200,000 casualties so far in the war, with a large amount being lost in the past couple months. This rate of attrition has altered the perception of the future of the war, with some predicting that there in fact won't be a large-scale offensive by Russia. In fact, it's believed that Putin's speech on the 24th will not include any further mobilization or expansion of the war. If this is the case, then Putin may be accepting that he's not going to get the manpower he's needed to regain the initiative, and he's actually in serious trouble. If Ukraine can continue to not give up large swaths of territory and instead grind Russian forces down in areas like Bakhmut and Kremenna, they may have the opportunity for a counteroffensive in the future. It's been said that the new Russian offensive should begin any day now, if it hasn't already. And if it has, then Bakhmut and Kremenna may be the rubric for what we'll be seeing. There may not be massive dashes across Ukraine or a huge drop of VDV. Frankly, those forces simply don't exist anymore. Russia may instead have opted for a large, grinding offensive, hoping that they can attrit Ukraine more than Ukraine attrits them. If Bakhmut is an example, it's really not going to go well for them. This is why I think we may not see an offensive. Russia may still do it, as they haven't shaken in their maximalist objectives, at least not publicly. That said, they may see that their best chances would be to elongate the war, grind Ukraine down, and really keep the war in a standstill similar to what we saw between 2014 and 2022. Albeit, they'll be in a much worse position than they were during that stretch, so it's certainly not a position they'd want to stay in long term. They'll have to make a choice quickly though. Ukraine is getting more and more gear from the West, and morale seems to remain pretty high. Ukraine's reasons and will to fight have been much more compelling than Russia's, and you can see that not only in how this war has gone on, but how this week has been fought.